It's been a long time since I played Metal Gear Solid. It's been about a decade since I finished the original release for the first time on PS2. I was using the backwards compatibility and a PS1 memory card on a PS2 in like 2013, at the end of the PS3 generation. It was it was a major milestone. Because that was the same memory card I used on Final Fantasy VII, the same one that kept crashing and like deleting all my data, and like I kept getting worried that like I would lose all of my Metal Gear save files, and so I had to like rush through the game, and I just kind of like. By the time I finished it, I was just like, I was more concerned about losing my data than like actually enjoying the game. And, I was like, I didn't watch a ton of movies. So like, playing Metal Gear Solid, I loved the game, right? I always thought very highly of it. I always thought it was like stellar. I'm a big fan of Metal Gear Solid 3, a big Metal Gear fan in general. But like because of that experience, like it was way too stressful for me to ever return to Metal Gear Solid. Okay, for completely arbitrary, has nothing to do with the game reasons, I never went back to Metal Gear Solid. So for me, having the collection on Nintendo Switch, Metal Gear Solid Volume 1, you know, all the good Metal Gear games, the first two on MSX and Metal Gear Solid, which I is the one I decided to start with, Metal Gear Solid 2 and Metal Gear Solid 3, I have been having a blast, going through Shadow Moses again, experiencing all everything the game has to offer, getting into these boss fights, enjoying the stealth mechanics, appreciating the cinematography and the storytelling, right? Because the game is very primitive in a lot of ways, I don't think like a lot of the writing holds up very well, a lot of like aspects established in the lore were like retcon. Like I would say this is the Metal Gear game that struggles the most with continuity because it does this thing where like the MSX games happened and then like the characters don't really acknowledge them, and then like there are things that happen in the later games that like just kind of lead to this one being retcon to a certain extent. Like it's really weird playing this game, but like with what you have, like with what you know about like the franchise as a whole, right? But like, I don't think there's any denying that this is the most grounded, AAA, like most normie friendly Metal Gear game, right? Because it's about a guy sneaking into a military base to like do battle with like other guys, right? Super powered super soldiers, right? In these anime-esque fights, and like there's all these conspiracies and all these like plot twists, and like it's very well done and very well presented. It is like it really is an innovator when it comes to storytelling and cinematic direction in video games. I think the game is itself is like very limited compared to like real technical like gameplay innovators like Ocarina of Time and Super Mario 64. But like from you know an actual like cinematic perspective, like this game is like the series as a whole, I think, is the best when it comes to like its when it comes to its characters, when it comes to its world building, when it comes to like the implementation of like storytelling and like gameplay. Like Metal Gear really is a cut above the rest in that regard, right? And so much so that like it really makes me like think back to like 10 years ago where people tried to convince you that The Last of Us was some major milestone when it came to like storytelling and in video games, right? Like, are you serious? Like, are you delusional? Like, compare like that cool, amazing opening to Metal Gear Solid, where like you're in the submarine, you come out in the scuba suit, and like Colonel Campbell is explaining like the situation, like Foxhound has seized this military operation, like they're threatening to fire nukes. They have like a couple of hostages who have names and backgrounds and personalities and like roles in the plot, right? You have like you have to do this, you have to like this is a sneaking mission. You have to acquire weapons on site. You have to do this, and this. Like, you have this, like, amazing opening sequence, right? This phenomenal thing. And it is so well implemented into the gameplay. Well, like, when you start sneaking in, when you have to, like, fight those guys in front of the elevator, when you have to wait for it to come down, when characters are explaining to you the controls and how the codec works, and like, how to how to use weapons and like sharing like philosophy and personal thoughts and like real world history and in universe history with you through codec conversations. Like there is just this sense that like wow, this is the greatest blend of cinematic and storytelling game design out of any game ever, right? Like nothing Neil Druckmann, Naughty Dog, any other PlayStation developer has done has ever come close to what MGS accomplished in 1998, right? This is a game that really understood what it means to take a Hollywood script, a Hollywood concept and like implement it into a video game format with like real boss fights, real stakes, a real story, real plot twists, real revelations about the characters that you thought you knew. Like it is so good, right? It's so much better than anything that came after it in this regard, right? Like, and I feel like almost like, why wasn't this game talked about more during that like discourse where people in 2013 where like the gaming industry was trying to convince us that The Last of Us Part 1 was like the Citizen Kane of gaming because Citizen Kane was a big deal because of its innovation in storytelling and editing. Like I think it had like transitionary like shots and stuff like that. Like it kind of innovated and like it kind of innovated a number of techniques that filmmakers use today, right? Like that are considered standard for the industry, right? Like what exactly did The Last of Us innovate? Like what exactly did it do? Whenever people bring this up, all they can do is just like, ha ha ha, the ending is ambiguous, except it's not because like the creators like have specifically come out and tried to tell you like what you're supposed to feel. Oh, by the way, by creator, I mean like Neil Druckmann. There's been this weird conspiracy lately that like Amy Hennig wrote the first game and Druckmann wrote the second, which is why the second was so bad. But like in reality, Druckmann wrote the first one as well. I like there's this weird. I'm pretty sure it's like a viral marketing campaign to try and like convince people that like Druckmann is like some real talent or something, and that people like loved his work on the first game. But like no, like in reality, the first game was never good. You were gaslit into thinking it was amazing. But yeah, like what exactly did The Last of Us accomplish? Like what exactly did it do? And like when you look at like the current state of like video games, like you see games like God of War and Days Gone and like all of these things, like PlayStation tried to imitate The Last of Us with all of these other games, right? And they never ever were able to replicate the success because like the success of The Last of Us was entirely hinged on like this obsessive like worship of PlayStation that was established by the genuine love and passion that people had for MGS. The Last of Us, the cinematic direction, the nonstop dialogue, the general structure, it is a perversion of what made Metal Gear Solid great. Like The Last of Us is a symptom of like a diseased dying corpse that was at one point like a completely vibrant healthy video game IP, right? Like The Last of Us is an example of how real talent, like really good ideas that really resonate with people and like are still talked about 25 years later, these major things, right? Metal Gear Solid, right? The Last of Us just took everything good about that and just ruined it. And people went along with it for way, way too long, right? It didn't take, it wasn't until the sequel that people started realizing that, like, Naughty Dog and Neil Druckmann, like, weren't all that. And if it wasn't for, like, the politically motivated nature of that, like, I really don't think people would have ever admitted that The Last of Us Part 1 was never a good game to begin with, right? It's a really interesting phenomenon, something that I wish was talked about more in the gaming sphere. Like I I feel like a lot of PlayStation games in the mid 2000s up to like The Last of Us, like they entirely sold themselves on this like out of like hype, out of like the hype cycle. This idea that like everything they were putting out was like top tier, amazing stuff, and like they would trick like millions of people into buying all of these games. But in the end, like they just didn't amount to much. They were not a big deal, right? Like how many games have they put out over the past decade that people have just completely forgotten about? Like when was the last time you heard someone talk about Gravity Rush, right? Or like Bioshock Infinite or like this or that. Like The Last of Us is only talked about because Neil Druckmann is still trying to make the IP a success story, right? He's trying to like um you know, he's run PlayStation into the ground trying to make this IP like a big name in gaming. Like, there are issues with like getting this multiplayer Last of Us game to take off, right? Right. He's had all these problems and like people don't want to admit it, right? Like people don't want to admit that The Last of Us just was not a success, is just not a high quality brand. Like the people behind it are not talented. Like with Metal Gear Solid, like people played the game, they had a great respect for its creators, for the people who worked on the game, for the voice actors, for like everything that went into it. Because Metal Gear Solid at its core is way better than anything Neil Druckmann or Naughty Dog will ever produce. Like this game is a downright masterpiece, and I hope that more people experience this game, its sequels, and the original releases on Nintendo Switch.